a lot for coming seminar. So today we're great to have Professor Konstantinos Spiliopoulos to speak in our seminar. Professor Spiliopoulos is now a professor at the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at Boston University, and his research interest has spanned a wide range of directions in mathematics, including probability, applied maths, computational maths, and recently machine learning. So one of his most influential work on neural networks training by mean field analysis has really sparked a lot of research in this field, including myself, the research of myself. So we're happy to have Konstantinos here today. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. The last time I was here probably was 10 years ago, something like that. So it has been a long time, or maybe earlier than that, still a long time. All right, so it says here 83 slides. I'm not going to go over all of them, so don't worry about it. I don't think I have time to go over the last part. But so what I will talk about here is I'll try to motivate the idea of looking at neural networks as statistical objects and trying to understand their performance and their properties through that lens. And it turns out that not all scalings are equal, and I will be more precise what I mean by that, which means which means that there are better ways to scale things, and they have different properties. And I will go through the main ways to do that, which is the midfield scaling, the square root scaling, which is what is being used a lot in the literature, which goes by the name of Xavier initialization, and then what happens in between, to cover the resume in between, and then I will conclude with some numerical results, and if we have time, we'll go a little bit over the proofs. What I will also say now, that will reiterate that as we're moving along, is that one of the contributions of this work or of this line of thinking is that in order to get proper limits, you need to choose hyperparameters appropriately. And that is what also is associated with, and it turns out that this is associated with good performance when you apply it in practice. And that is one of the usefulness of mathematics here, that it can essentially suggest informed choices for hyperparameters like learning rates, under which you have guarantees for convergence and understanding of how statistics of the predictors work. All right, so I'll probably skip the initial slides, which is a little bit more boilerplate. Now, neural networks have been used a lot, and there is a lot of work that has to be done in order to properly understand this kind of parametric models. And that has brought a lot of attention in recent years, and there are many questions that are still open, and I will comment on some of them in the end, but it is a very nice area to try and develop new methodologies and understand why algorithms work in many different applications. So there has been initially, there were these universal approximation theorems that essentially is kind of the basis for many of the results. And then there was an effort to understand like this issue of width versus depth, different structures. And then after that, there was the attempt to try and understand like limiting behavior. And this is where our work fits in. So today I will focus on, so when you talk about neural networks, there are many different architectures, which are just models essentially. And these are three of let's say main ones. So the first one is the feed-forward neural network, which is what I will focus on today. And then you have recurrent neural networks for which very recently we had the results, and more complicated recurrent neural networks kind of structures. I will not really talk about this. So there is a lot of, if one wants to work on this, there is a lot of follow-up things that one can do. I'll skip the image recognition. So a neural network is essentially, in its simplest form, is basically this red part over here, which is a superposition of semi-linear functions. So W times X is an affine function of X. X is the input, W is a parameter, could be a vector. So you have a dot product here. You apply some function, typically non-linear, otherwise you would have a linear model. And then you may multiply it by something and you sum over the i's. So this is a superposition of semi-linear functions, if you want. And for this kind of structures, it was understood a long time ago that they have this universal approximation kind of property. So which means that in a certain sense, they will be able to approximate any reasonable function. So then there are many questions of like speed of convergence and many other things. Now, for a very long time, so when one is using a structure like this, the uniform approximation theorems say that if n is large enough, then this red part over here would be approximating, in a certain sense, any reasonable function. Now, people that have been working on this in practice realized very early on that if I use a structure like this, in order to approximate some function, when n gets very large, because I'm adding stuff, I run into the danger of having something that has, let's say, huge variance. So then there was a line of work around 2000s, trying to understand maybe that, maybe then I should be normalizing this by something, or maybe I should be sampling the parameter Ci and Wi when I initialize them from some distribution that is scaled with a number of parameters, so somehow the variance is maintained as I move along the sequence. And that work was very influential, and that is what brought what Xavier initialization is, which essentially amounts to putting a 1/√n here. I will talk about this in a minute, but first I decided to talk about another normalization, which is the 1/n. And this is what we call mean field normalization. My point is that here you can put many things multiplying this, and all of them will lead to good behavior, but not all of them are equal. So let me first talk about the 1/n normalization. Okay. So the terminology is that this sigma is an activation function, and this is the sigma of Wix is the ith hidden layer, and you have many of them, n of them, and the number of units will be n. All right. And typically in this kind of things, let's say in a regression kind of problem, you would have data x and y, and you want to find the parametric function g that is such that g of x is as close to y as possible, let's say in this mean square sense. This would amount to the population mean square, and then there is the empirical mean square error, which is essentially is the same thing, but living on the empirical distribution. Now, this parametric model has a theta here, and theta would be essentially, let me go back, would essentially be these parameters, Ci and Wi, for I goes from 1 through n. And you are trying to estimate those parameters. And the typical way that you would do that would be some kind of a gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent, and there are many versions of this. So in this talk, I will focus on the simplest version of stochastic gradient descent, which says that the next value of the parameter is the previous value minus a learning rate, or a step size if you want, times the derivative of this, evaluated at the parameter of interest, in this case, C. But I'm not going to use the whole number of observations that I have. I will only be randomly sampling one observation each time. And this is what makes it stochastic. So this is like a stochastic gradient descent. Makes sense? Yes. Okay. And these formulas are different because this formula has derivative of this with respect to C, and the formula at the bottom has derivative of the same thing, but with respect to W. And again, I'm doing the plain vanilla stochastic gradient descent with, for those of you that are familiar with this terminology, with batch size 1, which means that I'm randomly sampling one data point, and this is what I'm using in the kth iteration. And then I will be iterating this till convergence. What does it mean, convergence? Till the objective function, or the empirical value of it, goes beyond a certain threshold. And when that happens and stabilizes there, I'm happy, and then I stop the iteration. Now, all this scheme is supposed to work well when k is large and when n is also large. All right. Okay. So then that motivates the question, okay, when you say that this is supposed to work well when n is large and when k is large, what do you mean by that? Can we quantify what that means? So when you say to a probabilist, this works well when n is large, a probabilist means that these things limit theorems. So this is also what we thought here. So how can we guarantee convergence of the algorithm? Other questions. How does the distribution of the trained parameters evolve over time? So if I take a step back, this I have to start from some given time, 0. So when I start, I initialize from some random distribution. Let's say C is from some uniform, W is from some normal. So I just flip a coin, or I draw a random number, and then that evolves. So then I can think of these CIs and WIs as particles. And then I have n of them. So I can think of the empirical distribution. Okay. Now, obviously is a big word, but because CIK plus 1 is related to CIK, and through this, they are related to all of the CIs, they will not be independent. They will be coupled. So then the question is, if I form the empirical distribution, how does this look like? And this, for those of you that have seen this before, that have seen related things before, this would immediately scream like, I am an interacting particle system. Do something with me, thinking of that in that direction. So this is really an interacting particle system. All right. So as I said, that motivates. Let's form the empirical distribution of the parameters. And when you write this, you realize maybe why I put the 1 over n normalization up front. Because then I can write the neural network as an affine function of the empirical distribution of the parameters. So even though the neural network is a very nonlinear function of the parameters, it's actually a linear function of their distribution. So I can really then write that, I can really realize that, okay, this is from that point of view, is a simple object. It's like a linear function of some empirical distribution. Okay. Now, as I said before, these algorithms work well when both k and n go to infinity. So this motivates the question, okay, maybe I should look at this, at the limit of this as k and n go to infinity. So I have two parameters. It turns out, if you start writing it down a little bit and thinking about it, that there is a natural relation between the two. The natural relation is to think k to be of order n. So if I plug in k to be n times t, it has to be an integer, so I use the floor function, but proportional to n, let's say, then I can form a scaled empirical measure. This is how we call it, for lack of better word here, which is a function of just one parameter. And when you write it like that, you immediately have a measure-valued stochastic process. Okay. So then the question is how this behaves as n goes to infinity. So I have simplified the problem. I had two parameters, now I have one parameter. It turns out, I mean, I don't want you to look at this formula, I will explain it in a minute, but it turns out that you can prove that this scaled empirical measure that I wrote before actually converges in distribution as n goes, in probability as n goes to infinity, to some quantity that you can characterize. Converges to a measure, and that measure has a density, and that density satisfies a PD, which is very complicated, and we don't want even to look at it. Now, this PD, even though it seems a little bit weird, let me go to the next slide, it can actually be written in a nicer form. It's a non-local, non-linear PD. Maybe I should go one. For those of you that are have a little bit of experience with that, I would just say that this is the PD that governs the density, the evolution of the density of the limiting distribution. And it is non-linear, but it's also non-local. Non-local in the sense that it depends on this V over here, which depends on the solution P, but in an integral form. So it's not a local equation, it's a non-local equation. However, that's fine. One can then still take the empirical loss and scale k by n times t and look at the limit of this, and you get that the limit empirical loss will obviously look something like that, where this G bar is the limiting empirical, is the limiting neural network, the limiting model, let's say. Okay, so far? Yes. If you have questions, just stop me. All right. Now, the other thing that was very interesting was that when we derived that, this kind of equations have been studied in the literature. So they go back to transport theory, and there is a very, very nice book. And they are okay. The book by Ambrosio is a very well-written book, and there are obviously papers too. But they analyze this kind of equations, and this PD is a gradient flow in the space of probability measures endowed with the correct topology. Now, this means that you can also prove here, I haven't written it down, that the derivative of the limiting loss with respect to time is non-positive, so it's actually negative, which means that there is a tendency to go down, and indeed that is what happens. Okay, so there is a lot of theory behind this, so that is good news. So what have we learned? We have learned that, okay, if you give me a neural network, if you scale this by 1 over n, you sample the parameters from, let's say, uniform and Gaussian or Gaussian and Gaussian, then, and if you look at the empirical distribution of the parameters, that object has a limit, the limit has a density, and the density satisfies a non-local PD, and that basically means that the limiting loss, that density is trying to minimize that limiting loss. So things are good. Things are good. Then you say, okay, now that I understood that, maybe let me understand the corrections to this. The limiting PD here is a deterministic object. So then the next question that we posed was that, okay, what about the error of this? So, which means let's look at the central limit theorem kind of a question. Yes.
Okay. So you said that it's trying to minimize the loss. Does it converge to zero?
Very good question. The answer is that for this type, okay, your question is good. For this type of gradient descent, it's actually not known unless you impose further restrictions. So if you put noise here, or if you include the penalization term here, then you can actually prove without any extra assumptions that you go indeed. If you don't do that, you need extra conditions because this is a transport equation. So you need extra conditions. If you have a diffusion equations, so if you have essentially a regularization term, which is either a penalty term here or noise, extra noise here, like Gaussian, let's say, variables, then you can prove that yes, it converges. In this setting, which is the setting that would be used, that is typically used in practice, you need extra conditions to say that. Okay. That's why I was careful in the choice of models.
Yeah.
So the next, as I said, the next question was what about the error? So if you look at the error as you know, someone coming from applied mathematics probability, you would think like central limit theorem. So that's what we did, and this is called fluctuations. So you take the empirical measure, you subtract the limit, and you normalize it by the appropriate normalization. In this case, it's square root of n. And then you realize, this is not that important to read. You realize after some work that this new object is, one can prove that it does converge to something, and this something is stochastic evolution equation, is a stochastic PDE. It's an equation that is driven by Gaussian martingale. The important thing here is that no matter how complicated this looks, this is an affine equation in eta bar, which is the limit. So you have an affine equation driven by Gaussian martingale. So the distribution will be Gaussian. And for this, we have also, you can also characterize the correlation function, but I'll skip that for now. But at the end of the day, what you have that the fluctuations in the limit can be proven to be Gaussian. Okay. And the correction is essentially this 1/√n, and that is the speed of convergence. Okay, so we did that for the shallow neural network, which means one layer. And then the next question that we posed was that whether you can do this for the deep neural network, meaning deep neural network is nothing else but a multi-layer structure where its object is a composition of itself with a copy of itself, but with different parameters. So it's a composition of things here. So this is a two-layer neural network. You can do the same kind of thing, but now you can have different number of units per hidden layer. So you can have different learning parameters for every layer. And this is stochastic gradient descent. It's more complicated because you have more parameters, but at the end of the day, it is basically just gradient descent for each parameter where you sample, where you use a batch size of 1 for the evolution, for the evaluation of the gradient. Now, it turns out, I will not go that much deep to this, but this was a quite complicated question. It turns out that you cannot actually write down, I mean, you can, but it's kind of pointless, the empirical distribution of the parameters. The reason is that in the shallow neural network case, we could write down the empirical distribution, and then we could get a closed equation for this. In this case, you can write down the empirical distribution, but you cannot get a closed equation because of the feedback mechanism. So after trying and you know, kicking our head against the wall all the time, we took a step back and we said, okay, we don't really know how to do it in such generality. Maybe let's do something simpler, but still hopefully useful, which is to study the limit of the neural network itself. So before we were able to study the empirical distribution of the parameters, and then the neural network was just an affine function of that. So here we said, okay, we cannot really understand how to do the empirical distribution. We'll take a step back, we'll go directly to study the neural network itself. So it turns out that this has a limit. It's way more complicated looking, but one can prove that it has a limit. The important thing in this derivation, in this result, is not so much the limit that it has, but the fact, and that I will focus on more in the next part of the talk, the fact that in order to actually get the limit, you have to choose the learning rates in an appropriate way with respect to N1 and N2. And it turns out that different parameters are being learned at different speeds. So there is a time scale separation going on. So if you choose them in that way, you will get convergence. And then I will show you plots where you don't choose them that way and you get rubbish. So the theory here, the advantage of the theory is that it gives you a mathematically informed way to choose the hyperparameters. I will discuss this in 5 minutes in a setting that will be easier to present. But going back to that, still in this case, you can, because of the structure of the limit, we can prove that essentially the limiting objective function acts as a Lyapunov function for the limiting or governing the dynamics of the limiting neural network, and it's non-negative, the derivative, and under the proper assumptions, you can say that it converges to a stationary distribution, which minimizes which achieves the global minimum. So, which is kind of a guarantee of why of this normalization actually working. So let's see what insights have we gained. First of all, as n goes to infinity, the neural network converges to a deterministic model. Second of all, we chose here the learning rate to be constant, even though because of the scaling with 1 over n, there was an implicit scaling actually, so it's not really that it's constant. The other thing is that due to the McKean-Vlasov kind of limit, like the large particle limit, you also have propagation of chaos, which means that if you start, let's say, the particles being independent, as the training goes on, they are very much coupled, but after a point, they act like independent particles. So, which kind of suggests that why over-parameterization doesn't hurt here. At the end of the day, when n is very large, you have many, many particles, but they are actually acting as being independent ones. For the fluctuations, you get an approximation to the distribution of to the empirical distribution of the parameter, which is essentially Gaussian with mean mu bar and variance of order 1 over n with some variance covariance structure which has been characterized. So the point is that up to first order, this is the approximation that you get. And the other thing is that you need, in order to get this kind of behavior, the number of times that you iterate the process should be proportional more or less to the number of hidden units. Okay, all right. Now I will change gears for a minute, and then I will go back to what I was discussing before and connect the two. And so let me now change gears and let me now study the square root normalization. The square root normalization is actually very much what is being used, what has been used in practice for many, many years, which goes back to Xavier, to Gloren and Bengio in 2010. And this was essentially, they had a lot of intuition about this. They realized that this has to be normalized somehow, because if you just keep adding stuff and stuff and stuff for a very long sum, this thing will explode. So they said, okay, maybe this normalization looks good, and it did. the motivation for this, if you read the original paper, is a very good motivation. Essentially, what they said is that effectively what they said in the multi-layer case, you would like to have the variance as you go from one layer to the other to be the same. And that is kind of the sweet spot, let's say. However, when they derived that, they didn't take training into account. It was without any training. It was good motivation, but without any training. So, for example, through their explanation, you would never get the 1/n normalization. They got the 1/√10. So we said, okay, let's do the same game again. This is the regression loss, like the mean square error. This is like now the SGD updates. Let me do the same thing as before. The empirical distribution of the parameters. Now I can still write this as a affine function of the empirical distribution, but because of the normalization, I will have a √n outside. This doesn't mean that this diverges, because remember, I have also training. So I can choose the learning rate so that this will converge. I will still do the same scaling here, and in the end, I get that in the end, I get two things. First of all, that the scaled empirical measure in the previous case, in the mean field normalization, was converging to a non-trivial object, which was a solution to a PDE. In this case, it's converging to a constant, which is the initialization of the parameters. So as n goes to infinity, mu nt for any t will be converging to a constant measure. And that's why sometimes this is called the linear regime, in the sense that the empirical distribution is actually centered around the initialization of the parameters, whereas in the mean field scaling, it evolves. And so the limit of this is basically trivial in this case, and the limit of the scaled empirical measure is a solution to an ODE, and this is the ODE, and this AXX prime, these are components of a matrix, which is called neural tangent kernel. It's a matrix that has, it's a positive definite matrix. So one can prove that this is a positive definite matrix. And because of the structure of the ODE, you realize that as t goes to infinity, this is mean reverting, and this is positive definite. So it will be converging to y. And indeed, it's not difficult to show that indeed you have this. So this is good. You get convergence to the global minimum. However, there is a difference between this convergence to the global minimum and the previous convergence to the global minimum. The difference is that this is only proven for in-sample data, whereas the previous one was for the whole distribution. So it would cover both in-sample and out-of-sample. Okay, so this is a key difference. Yeah.
So when you define with the square root, you did like the SGD with 1/√n, right? Or
no, here I just
with learning rate.
So learning rate alpha n, I haven't specified yet what this is. And then this 1/√10 comes from the derivative here. Because when I differentiate this with respect to C, I get immediately from the 1/√10 because of the scaling.
Right, and I think usually you want the acceleration in time to be the same as the drift of the gradient, so they can kind of cancel out.
So you will choose the learning rate in order to achieve this. So the learning rate is a parameter that I haven't chosen.
Okay.
I'll come to the chase of the parameters. I'm just keeping this for the end. So those things then motivate the question. Okay, we have some understanding of what happens in the 1/n and 1/√10. What happens in between? So then we looked at between the two. So now I will put a gamma parameter there. Everything else is the same. So the goal of this work was to say, okay, can we compare these two regimes, the 1/√10 and the 1/n regime? So when we asked that question, we didn't really know how to do this. So we said, okay, let's first of all understand what happens in between, and maybe through that, we'll see how to compare them. So let's put a gamma there, and this gamma would be between 1/2 and 1. Okay. Let's do this first for the shallow case. So the questions here to ask are the following. What is the behavior of the neural network for large N and large T when gamma is between those two values? What about variance bias trade-off, and how can one compare the different scalings in terms of performance, test accuracy, or whatever makes sense? So it turns out that when gamma is between 1/2 and 1, for any gamma in that range, one can write down an asymptotic kind of expansion for the neural network output. This HTN gamma is the neural network. You do the training, and then okay, you have that S(n) goes to infinity, this converts to HT. This HT is the same HT as this for all gammas, strictly less than 1 for all gammas. So the first order convergence is the same. Then you go to the next order, you essentially do a central limit theorem kind of analysis. And then you realize that this okay, looks a bit complicated, but it is composed of two different things. This thing with the Q and this thing with the script G. This thing with the script G, this is random, and script G is the distribution at initialization. This A is the same metrics that I showed you before in the root n normalization. So this is a positive definite thing. This Q is, these are deterministic quantities that are coupled through the index J. But so this thing over here is deterministic, and this over here is random. The interesting thing is that the dependence on gamma is only through the prefactors in the n minus gamma minus 1/2 here and here. So neither Q nor A nor this G have any gamma dependence on them. Now, this is an amazingly simple but very, very illuminating structure. This says that when n is large, to leading order in n, I can have this approximation of the neural network, where the dependence on gamma, if I just focus on this term, which is what carries the uncertainty quantification, if you want, is only through the prefactor. So this says that if I fix that if n is large but fixed, this could be minimized when gamma is equal to 1. This asymptotic expansion is only true for gamma strictly less than 1, but it is monotonic with gamma, and it gets minimized when gamma tends to 1. So this kind of suggestive of the idea that the mean field normalization is perhaps superior to the other normalizations because it achieves a predictor, if you want, which has the minimum, which has the smallest variance within that class of statistical predictors. Okay. Now, both this term, which is deterministic, and this term, they both go to 0 as t goes to infinity, and both of them go exponentially fast. This goes exponentially fast to 0 as t goes to infinity, and this one too. And they both go to 0 as n goes to infinity. So this is like the bias terms, if you want, the first order correction. But the important thing is perhaps exactly this, that the dependence on gamma is very simple and very, very decoupled. Now, right, and this is what I'm writing here, that the norm of the variance covariance matrix is essentially, in the shallow case, is essentially of the order here, and it is the square of what I had before, so it is monotonic in gamma. So it's a very, very simple structure. And the same thing happens also with the bias, very similar behavior. And then you say, okay, let me run some experiments to see what happens. So in this experiment, this was on the MNIST data set, which is just checking the time, which is like the first kind of data set that you would test the ideas on more or less any machine, any kind of algorithm. So here, what we did here, and so for those of you that do not know, the MNIST data set is a data set that has numbers from 0 to 9, handwritten numbers. It has 70,000 of them. We keep 50,000 for test, for train, and then the other 20,000 is for test. So essentially the computer as input gets pixels like black or white that make up a number. And then, so this is a categorical variable type of problem. So the output is a number of from 0 to 9, and it gives you probability of a number being 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So here here we use the mean square error just to match the theory, to be able to match the theory, and we use the single layer neural network. Now, in all of the simulations, everything was the same other than gamma. The only thing that changes in these figures is gamma, nothing else. So this is the performance of different neural networks, different in the sense that only gamma changes, nothing else. So what you see, this is test accuracy, or the part of the data that the neural network has not seen, as a function of gamma, as a function of epochs in this direction, but in this direction as a function of gamma. The interesting thing is that this is monotonic in gamma. Okay, as mimicking essentially the behavior of the variance. So, which means that out of sample performance is also monotonic in gamma, at least in this case. So gamma equals 1 achieves the best of all out of sample performance. All right. Then we said, and now we come to the scalings. Then we said, okay. Yes.
The last slide. I guess I'm surprised that the one with more hidden mutants is performing significantly worse. Is that just like overfitting?
Yeah.
Most likely.
Yeah, but keep in mind that here you see, we didn't try to optimize anything. The goal was to have an apples to apples comparison, where the only thing that would be changing would be gamma and nothing else. I didn't try to optimize the learning rates. I didn't try to optimize anything. I only ran the algorithm blindly, sampling initialization from the same distribution. And the only thing that I wanted to change was gamma, was to see how this behaves with gamma if I don't try to mess up with that in any way. In both figures, it is monotonic in gamma. All right. So then we said, okay, can we do this with multi-layer neural networks? With multi-layer neural networks, the situation is a lot more illuminating and a lot more. The conclusions are a lot more useful. I have not written down here all the system of equations because there are many, but if you write down the SGT, for example, this is a two-layer neural network. You had written before. You need to choose the so each parameter can have a different learning rate. In order to get convergence, so in order to get, I wrote it here, I forgot. So you have the different learning rates. You apply the SGD in the evolution of the neural network, and then you realize that I can still have an asymptotic expansion, which means that I can rigorously study the first convergence, then I can do the central limit theorem, study the second order convergence, and so on and so forth. For all of this to work, you need to pick the learning rates appropriately with respect to N1, N2, and gamma 1, gamma 2 in this case. And these are the formulas that will give you this, will make the asymptotic expansion valid. You can iterate that, and you can do this also for a 3-layer neural network, 4, 5. In the paper we have for arbitrary number of. But the important thing is that the theory is valid under specific choices of learning rates. Okay. And if you look at this, start looking at this a bit more carefully, you will realize that different parameters learn at different rates. So they don't learn all at the same rate. So let me give you now an example, which is a little bit, so this is the MNIST. I guess this example is like, in many ways an unfair comparison, but I want to make a point. So this blue curve, this is again on the MNIST data set, and this blue curve is test accuracy when you do the mean-fit scaling. And this is when you don't do any scaling. Of course, these are two very extreme scenarios. You will never do the red one. So this is like running gradient descent, but without blindly running this, without choosing the initialization in any smart way, just blindly running the algorithm, sampling from some distribution. Doesn't learn anything. In practice, people would never really do this. In practice, people would run, they would then change the learning rate, do it adaptively, they would do things like that. Here, I didn't do any of this. I wanted to emphasize how important is to either normalize the initialization or scale the neural network. So if you scale the neural network, in this case, I did the mean-fit scaling, it immediately goes up to 90% accuracy. And then, okay, you need to do something smarter to pick up the rest 10%. But it immediately gives you the bulk of the distribution. All right, so this was for, so, okay. All right. So let me now, so again, this is for some more numerical tests. So this is for MNIST. Again, like as I said, 70,000 images, 60 for training and 10 for testing. And here are the convergence plots that I showed you before. This is with the mean square error, and this is with cross entropy loss. With cross entropy loss, you get better results because it's also a more appropriate performance measure, because this is categorical variable. It's not really a regression problem. But the point is that even for cross entropy loss, for which we don't really have the theory was developed only for the mean square error, you still have this monotonic behavior with respect to gamma. So gamma equals 1 always performs better and always monotonic. And again, here I didn't try to optimize anything. It was essentially trying to compare apples to apples. Then we did the same thing for CIFAR10, where we used a convolutional neural network. For this, we don't have any theory, so theory is yet to be done. But we wanted to study, at least empirically, whether the same phenomenon happens. So CIFAR10 is essentially 60,000 images of 10 classes. So instead, so airplane, car, bird, etc. So 50,000 of them are using for train, and the rest 10,000 are using for test. And what we did, we had a convolutional neural network. We scaled the layers with 1/n to the gamma for different ends. There were 8 convolutional layers, each one 64 channels, and a fully connected layer in the end. So these things are probably not that important. The point is that this was a genuine convolutional neural network, so not a feed-forward neural network. But we did the scaling that I mentioned before, and again, we got, without trying to optimize anything again, we got that the test accuracy is increasing in the parameter gamma. So the mean field normalization, even for the convolutional neural network, is the one that works the best without having really to do anything really smart. And it achieves very high performance, like very quickly. Now, in order to improve this, you have to then learn essentially the tail of the distribution, which requires more work. But even just staying with that, you have already reached like 85, 87% accuracy. And then beyond that, okay, you have to work harder. Yeah.
So you talk about gamma, of course, it's part of the normalization, but you're also affecting the learning rates with gamma,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So does bigger gamma means faster learning rates, and maybe that's why it performs better?
Yes and no. For example, in the one layer, let me show you here. The one layer, which is easier to think about, the learning rate was this. So for gamma equals 1, this was fixed.
Yeah.
For gamma equals 1/2, this was 1/n.
Right, so the bigger the gamma, the faster the learning rate.
Yeah, but it is, I mean,
Much faster. Like,
I'm not sure I want to concentrate around this because this would suggest that if I have an even faster one would be better. No, that's not necessarily the case. It's like a balance, right? It's right. So it doesn't necessarily mean that faster is better. This is like, for this kind of scaling, this is the right balance.
yeah, I mean, there's a limit. You cannot just put faster, it's gonna perform better, but it's well known that the faster learning rate, you have faster convergence, even though you have more noisy. So maybe it's not the normalization, it's the learning rate, the one that accelerates.
Yes, but for example, if I were to use this learning rate, if I were to use fixed learning rate of square root normalization, then the neural network actually goes to infinity, which means it won't be the right choice, which means that you cannot really mix and match.
Yeah, no.
So that's why I'm trying to avoid thinking in terms of faster is better. I'm trying to think more that for this kind of architecture, this is the correct scaling. Yes, it turns out to be faster, but it is with this type of architecture. If I were to use this scaling, this rate with the other architecture, it wouldn't really work.
Yeah, so I'm thinking I want to use the faster rate, therefore I need to use the mean field normalization.
Perhaps. No, what you're saying has a point, but I'm not sure whether the explanation is because of the faster learning rate. It has to do also with other things. As I said, with the square root normalization, you can guarantee in-sample convergence. With the mean field normalization, you have convergence of the whole distribution. So this is suggestive that this is probably better. Now, is this because of the faster sampling learning rate? Is this because of the scaling? I think it's a combination of both. All right.
So
this is test. Yes.
So are you saying that these lines are converging to different endpoints? If we were to run these for more epochs?
Well, no. I mean, this will slowly go up, but the point is that, I mean, it could saturate at some point, but the point is that, you know, how fast. This shows that if you use the mean field scaling, you go to a good accuracy very quickly. Then to improve that, you have to do something smarter. I agree. Maybe you need to adapt the learning rate. You have to do now smarter things that you do in practice. But the point is that you have already a very good starting point, and then you can build on that. But at least you have a guarantee that if I start with this, I know that in a very few, within a very few epochs, I'll be doing very well. And then I will have to improve on that. I agree. We haven't studied that next. All right. So for the proofs, I don't really have time as I predicted, but let me just show you I'll just give you 2 minutes the sketch and that's it. Okay. So these are measure valued stochastic processes. So there are basically, in general, there are 3 steps. You need to prove that there is convergence. Then you need to identify the limit, and then hopefully there is uniqueness. So you are converging to one thing, not to 10. Let me skip this. Let me give you the idea of how you identify the limit. Maybe that's probably the main interesting and non-technical aspect of it. So you want to identify the limit, like the PD that I showed you in the very beginning. this is the midfield scaling. So you have the gradient descent updates. You say, okay, I want to study the distribution. I want to study the empirical distribution of the parameters. I want to study the limit of a measure. When you want to study the limit of a measure, it's much easier to study the limit of an integral of a measure with respect to a test function. So I'm doing the pairing of a test function f with the empirical distribution. And I look at this at two different times, like the update at time k and the update at time k plus 1. And then I do Taylor expansion on the function f that is sufficiently smooth. So if I do Taylor expansion, maybe I can write it here. So if I do this, this is this. Let's say that I have only one parameter, ck. Cky minus f of ki. I goes from 1 through n. Now, if f is sufficiently smooth, let's say that everything is nice, I can do Taylor expansion here. So this would be the derivative of f with respect to c of some point, let's say cky, times cky plus 1 minus cky, plus the error. All right, so this is Taylor expansion. But for this, I can use the update equations from the gradient descent. So this is exactly what you have over here. And you do the same thing also for the other part. And then you have here a learning rate alpha or alpha n. You have here a summation over n. And then for the scaled empirical measure, you do a telescopic type of series, and you realize that to write the difference at time t minus at time 0, you can write it as a sum of the differences of the actual empirical of the actual pairings for the empirical distribution of things like this. So you have two summations. You have one summation here in terms of n, and you have one summation here in terms of n. So for these things to balance, you need to be dividing by n squared. And this is how you choose the learning rate. So here, it has to be fixed. Otherwise, it would either go to 0 or to infinity. If this was not 1 over n squared, like in the midfield scaling, that it was 1 over root n, then this a would have to be 1 over n to the 3/2, so that things balance. So that in the end, these Riemann sums become legitimate integrals. And that's how you identify the limit. Okay. And then the rest, okay, you have to prove that the martingale terms go to 0. You have to prove uniqueness. I'll probably skip all of this. This was a duality argument. I'll skip this. So, okay, I'll skip the fluctuations. I think we're over time. So the summary, I try to show you the different, I try to motivate the question of looking at scaling limits as a way to try and understand statistical properties of these structures. The point is that for each fixed n, there has been a lot of work in the literature, like for concentration bounds. But here, the goal was to look at this as a statistical quantity. And that's very hard to do with fixed n. So we went to the limit, and then in order to do that, we tried to study the next order in the approximation. And then we said, okay, within this class of estimators, which one is better? And the conclusion was that the mean field estimator, if you want, for a lack of better name, is better. All right, now the code for all of this is here, and with Richard and Justin, we're finishing a book on also related to that, but on other stuff too. Okay, that's all. So this, the talk that I gave is a composition of many different papers. I try to give you the highlights of the results. Each one of them is a different work, and if you want, and we recently did something related for the recurrent neural network, which is a very different kind of structure. So I'll probably skip that. All right, thank you.
nice talk. Any questions? Yes.
Question, yeah, thanks for the next talk. So a lot of this depends on the choice of learning rate, as you
Yes.
said. You mentioned this briefly, that so in practice, people usually use some adaptive method, like
Yes.
an ASM or something.
Yes.
Have you tried to look at how like your choices compare to the adaptive ones?
No, no.
Are the adaptive ones choosing mean field scaling over?
No, I haven't.
Square
And,
root.
I mean, I haven't looked at it.
Yeah.
And it would be a very, very interesting direction to look at. I completely agree. The motivation here was, again, my interest in this was to try and see how the theory can yield a principled way to choose this. So here, for example, instead of SGD, I had a different kind of gradient descent, like, I don't know. Momentum is very similar, so I will not talk about momentum, but something more fancy, like an adaptive scheme. I will need to choose the learning rates in a different way. And then, yes, okay, this is a problem to be studied. In that case, how do you choose the learning rates so that we have convergence? So the answer is that there are many open problems. So more work to do.
Does it make sense, or is it clear what happens if you choose gamma to be greater than 1?
Yeah, so if you choose gamma to be, no, it's a good question. If you choose gamma to be greater than 1, then things break down. Actually, also if you choose gamma to be less than a half, like the good regime is 1/2 to 1, where the regime things make sense.
Another question. So I know you do a very different approach with limits and end up with a PDA, but have you looked at I guess where you put some norm on the space of the parameters and then perhaps use some contraction properties, prove that this is a contraction? I know there's like a bunch of work that approaches it this way. I don't know if you thought about it, or is it too hard to show?
I mean,
that
I'm
it's a
not
contraction?
exactly sure, but for example, I don't think I understood the question, but for example, in order to prove uniqueness, we have to prove that you have a contraction. So in the Wasserstein metric, this is how we prove uniqueness of the limit. I'm probably not answering your question.
Yeah, before the limit, like you have some sort of SGD update. So you have
Yes.
a one-step update. You could put a norm on the space of the parameter or an infinite dimensional space that contains all of them, and then show that your update is a contraction. And
Okay.
use that.
All right.
And a few.
No, I have, but what would that give you? What would that suggest?
With that, you can get like finite sample for finite n. You can do finite sample analysis or things like that. Yeah, I was wondering if you thought about it.
So the
like-
literature that I know on this, they do get these concentration bounds, but the works that I have seen, they're typically in terms of constants. They can really be really huge. So they're basically more or less in the asymptotic regime. My point is that, yes, this is true, but typically the concentration bounds that I have seen, that they are in terms of constants that come from Gronwall inequalities. And these are very big constants.
Yeah, there's some that they're not.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the truth, the honesty is that I haven't done that. But when one does this kind of, fixed sample kind of analysis, one has to be a little bit careful with the magnitude of the constants that they are controlling the error.
Yeah, they're bound.
They could be huge.
Yeah.
They could be huge. So
I just wonder if this was kind of impossible here, or if you think.
I doubt, and I'm sure that people may have already looked at it.
I think there are 2 questions in the chat.
Yes.
Q&A. I think one was a question about the earlier, right on the Q plus.
Yeah. So.
It's very early. You can answer the second one for me.
Have you studied? So if I have studied, so the question asks, if I have studied the couple limit for the tail for n and t both growing to infinity? The answer is no. In this work, t was in any given compact interval and n was going to infinity. So the answer is no. We have done that only in the case, I mean, but this is easy to do. In the case of, in the case where gamma is less than 1, then yes, that can be done and we have done it. In the case that gamma is equal to 1, we haven't done it, and the reason is that for the plane SGD, the theory for stationary solutions of this type of PDs has not been really developed to the extent that we can do that. If I add regularization terms, then yes, it can be done. Without the regularization terms, either as a penalty or as extra noise in the SGD updates, the PD literature is not there yet. So we don't really know, without assuming extra stuff, whether these PDs whether this PDs converge to a stationary regime. So there is an obstacle which comes not from this line of work, but from the PD literature.
Thanks a lot. I think in the interest of time, let's.
Did I stop sharing and close this?
Good.
Yeah, you can-